Hi readers, Chris here. Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my Stephen King journey. That is my journey to read all the books that Stephen King has ever written. This is just going to be part one. Don't know when I'm going to do part two after I read another chunk of his books. I'm just going to give you a quick little background on why I started this, when I started this, and then I'm going to talk about kind of my favorite books of my journey so far, my least favorite books, and which ones that I would recommend you should either read, or if you're new to Stephen King, what you can start off with first. So, some background information. My first Stephen King book that I ever read was actually Insomnia. I think I read Insomnia it was either late high school or early college, so about 20 years ago or so, I think. Anyway, I read Insomnia. I don't really remember much about it, honestly, but I remember thinking at the time, like, how intricate of a story it was. I know it's about a guy who can't sleep, he has insomnia, he sees these auras of people, and there's some, monsters that are running around the town that only he can see because of his insomnia and his special abilities. I thought this book was so cool, so that started me, this is what got me into Stephen King and started me reading some other of his books. And over the years, I have read, a handful of his books: Misery, Dreamcatcher, the Dark Tower series, etc., etc., etc. At some point, I want to say about four or 5 years ago, I had accumulated a pretty good collection of Stephen King books at that time, and I was like, hey, wouldn't it be a fun idea to start reading all of Stephen King's books, starting with his first book ever published, which was Carrie. Carrie was the first book he ever published back in, I think it was 79 or 80. So once I got Carrie, I literally took a notebook that I got at like a work conference. It's not anything special. I took a notebook and went on Wikipedia and started writing down all of Stephen King's books. I literally took this random notebook that I found lying around and went to Wikipedia.com, started making a list of every single Stephen King book. These are all by publication date, starting from Carrie, his first book, all the way down to a whole bunch of books, his short story collections, and then of course every time he comes out with a new book, like later Billy Summers, they get added to this list. And I started looking for them, and everyone that's checked off is one that I have. You can see I don't have the Institute or Billy Summers yet, or the Colorado Kid for some reason. The Plant, which it was like an ebook. It's not in print, so I can't get it unless I spend like thousands of dollars. But anyway, this is what I started with. This is how it's going, and I'm all the way down to it right now is where I am. Once I finish it, I'll move on to The Eyes of the Dragon. So, as you can see from my list, I've almost gotten every book that Stephen King has written. Just have a couple outliers out there. But I have read about 20 of his books so far, starting from Carrie, going through all the books that you see here, and the book that I'm currently reading is It. First, I'm going to talk about my favorites so far. And one of my favorites is going to be Carrie. It's number one. It's the original. It may not be like my favorite Stephen King book ever, or even my favorite in this bunch, but it is a really great book. It's about a young girl. She has, these powers. She's she's picked on in school. She's picked on at home. She has this very, uber crazy religious mother who doesn't let her do anything. And by the end of the book, she kind of takes back her life and takes back her power in a super crazy and bloody way. If you've seen the famous scene in the movie, you know what I'm talking about. But I think Carrie is a really great place to start if you're looking to get into King. It's not that long of a book. It's a pretty quick read, and I think it is a great start. Now, I already mentioned Firestarter in one of my videos earlier this week. Firestarter is another super good book if you're looking to get into King, because it's not too like horror, it's not too scary. And speaking of not too horror or not too scary, Stephen King in his early years published a handful of books under a different name, which was Richard Bachman. Now, for the most part, you can go out and get most of the Bachman books separately. I just happened to get them in this anthology because there is one particular book, Rage, that is no longer in print anymore. If you're not familiar with the book Rage, it is about a school shooting, so I'm sure you can understand why that book is no longer in print here in the US. I believe it might still be in print in other countries, so if you're in a country and you're interested in that, you can go look it up. But there are 4 books in here besides Rage. Rage is not my favorite of the Bachman books. My favorite of the Bachman books is actually a story called The Long Walk. Again, The Long Walk is a super cool story about a group of young boys. There's 100 of them, and every year they are picked to go on this long walk. They basically start up in Maine on like Route 95 and keep walking all the way across the country until they all die and there's one left standing. Because think about it, if you had a walk without stopping, you can't stop to eat, you can't stop to sleep, you can't stop to go to the bathroom, you just have to keep walking and walking and walking until your feet fall off and you die. It's a super cool story because even though the setup may not sound that fun, the characters in the story, like the boys, the different boys that are on the walk, the relationships that they form while they're walking, it's all super great stuff, and it's one of the things that I think that Stephen King is the best at, which is character development. The Long Walk is a great example of character development. Again, it's not like horror, monsters, and I think it's a really good example of that. And of course, I cannot talk about my favorite early King books without talking about The Stand. This is one of the biggest King books, although I think it might be bigger. I'm not quite sure exactly, but the unabridged version of The Stand, it's over 1,000 pages long. It is a complete epic tale about a world where a virus gets out, kills most of the world's population, which is horrifying enough, but after the remaining people that are left have to fight against this like ultimate evil, the Man in Black, Randall Flagg. He's a character that you see in a couple different King books, but his first appearance is here in The Stand. It's a crazy book. I could do a whole like series of videos just about The Stand, but if you are wanting to like really dive into the deep end of Stephen King books, The Stand is another great one to try if you have the stamina for it, because again, it's a really long book. And then last, one of my other favorite King books that I actually read earlier this year, and that is Christine. And yes, I'm a little bit biased because my name is Christine, but it's basically about a boy in his car. The car just happens to turn out to be evil. I love this book because it does such a great job building tension. From the very first page in this book, when a boy and his friend find the car on the side of the street, the one boy falls in love with the car, the other boy automatically knows that there is something wrong with this car. Throughout the 400 pages of this book, the one boy gets deeper and deeper, like obsessed with Christine. The other boy has to try and figure out how to save his friend. And the tension just builds and builds and builds and builds until it explodes at the end. And it is just, it's so great. Such a great job. Again, characters, building tension, another thing that King is so good at. So if you're looking for a super high tension, horrifying tale about an evil car, definitely give Christine a try. Before I move on to some of my least favorites, I do want to make some honorable mentions because there's a lot of super well-known popular books in King's early years. We've got The Shining, Pet Sematary, Salem's Lot, all super great books, and all these are much more in like the typical horror thing where you have like some otherworldly creature. In Pet Sematary, we've got, zombies, creatures coming back from the dead. In Salem's Lot, we've got vampires. In The Shining, you've got the evil Overlook Hotel. All those books are also super great. Moving on, I'm going to talk about some of my least favorite books in King's early years. Because let's face it, if you write that many books, not all of them are going to be winners. And the first one I'm mentioning is Different Seasons by Stephen King. So this is actually a collection of short stories or novellas. There are 4 novellas in here. The most famous one probably being Rita Hayworth in the Shawshank Redemption, which is the basis for the famous Shawshank Redemption movie. That's pretty much the only novella in here that I absolutely love. The rest of the novellas are just not that great because King does a really good job of taking the horror genre and finding horror in everyday life. So when most people think of horror, they think of evil hotels and zombies and vampires. That's not the case in these novellas. All the horror in these novellas comes from the horror of everyday life and the horror of ordinary people. And because of that, some of it is like really hard to read. So just for example, there's a novella in here called Apt Pupil, and it's about an old man who is a ex-Nazi officer and a young boy who kind of blackmails him into teaching him how to kill people, and it becomes this super toxic, unhealthy relationship. Both the characters are seriously deranged in like their own separate ways, and it's really hard to read because it's based on real life stuff, which is horrifying. And so to me, like, I can read a book about zombie cats and evil dogs and be okay with it because I know it's not real. But the stuff that's like super, super real, I have a hard time with that. It was a little bit hard to stomach. So some of these, they were hard to read, really hard to read. Next up, I have The Dead Zone, which I know a lot of people like, but for me, this one was lacking. Now, there's nothing like seriously wrong with it. It's about a guy who kind of has premonitions, so he can see things before they happen. He can warn people before terrible things happen. People find out that he has this ability, and then he's kind of, shunned and run out of town. And to me, I just felt like the story was very anticlimactic. Like, he helps or he tries to help the local community catch a serial killer, and like a couple of things happen throughout the book, but it didn't have, I don't feel, that like super climactic event that a lot of King's other books do that makes it really exciting. And I feel like this book didn't have that. So for me, this one does not measure up to some of the other ones. And then finally, I have The Talisman. Again, I read this earlier this year. It's a big book, and it was a co-written between Stephen King and Peter Straub. I'm not really familiar with Peter Straub. I've never read anything that he's written, so I can't really judge any contribution he may have made to this book. But as far as, King goes and comparing this to the rest of his works, again, I did not think that this one measured up. I didn't really like the main character, Jack. He goes on this odyssey of adventures, but I feel like all the things that he did and all the adventures that he had did not impact the rest of the story. So in other words, let's say Jack makes a cake, goes to the movies, meets a friend. If he had eaten a cake instead of made it, went to play in the park instead of a movie and made a different friend, like none of it wouldn't have mattered. He still would have ended up in the same place. So for me, this book was not as exciting as some of the other King books. King does have a habit of being super wordy sometimes, and I felt like this book was super, super wordy. Like pages to explain one thing or describe one thing, and not all of it made sense. So again, I know some people like this one. It didn't quite work for me. I know there's a sequel. I will read that at some point when I get to it on my list, but for me, The Talisman, not my favorite book, and not a good place to start. those are my thoughts on all the Stephen King books that I've read so far. I definitely plan on doing another update video at some point, maybe next year when I get farther along in my list. I try to read one book a month, but some of these books are just way too big to read in 1 month, so that's not going to happen. Anyway, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you're not already, please subscribe to my channel. I do new videos every Sunday, Wednesday, and sometimes on Friday. Thanks for watching, and happy reading.